Welcome to Alaska Weather, a production of Alaska Public Media and the National Weather Service, Alaska Region. Produced and broadcast daily from the studios of KAKM, Alaska Weather provides complete forecasts, public, marine, and aviation for all of Alaska. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
Alyeska Pipeline Service Company, fueling philanthropic programs and dedicated to creating educational and professional opportunities for Alaska Native people.
The National Weather Service.
Good Monday, everyone. I'm meteorologist Dave Snider with the National Weather Service. It is the 12th of December, and as always, we encourage you to stay up to date with your local weather information for your community. And you can do that very easily by calling the Alaska Weather Information Line at 800-472-0391. Find us online at weather.gov/Alaska. That's the whole statewide view at once. But you can easily click down into the interior, the west coast, into southwest, the Aleutians, south central, or southeast, anywhere you want, and then bookmark that result there as you'll continue to get your local forecast information with fewer clicks the next time. If you have any questions about what you find online, about social media, Facebook, Twitter accounts, or just like to share a picture from your neck of the woods, feel free to do so anytime. You can email any of us at nws.ar.tvweather@noaa.gov. Here's a look at the current weather situation. The worst weather right now that's reaching land anyway is out across the western tip of the Seward Peninsula and St. Lawrence Island, around the Bering Strait communities. Places like Savunga and Gamble and Teller, Brevig Mission and Wales. Now, those regions are probably going to see some strong and gusty southerly winds through the rest of the nighttime hours and could go as early as 5 o'clock tomorrow morning. Poor visibility with visibility down below a half mile at times. And we're also looking at some snow accumulation up to about 4 inches or so. So in this region, we've got colored in yellow. If you're out there and on St. Lawrence Island, you're probably talking about some blustery winter weather. A winter weather advisory is what we're calling that. And that means that dangerous travel conditions could exist there. So if you go out and away from the village for a little while, you might lose sight of the trail. Just be careful. Make sure people know that you're coming. And make sure you check in somewhere before once you get there and let everyone know that you've arrived safely. That way nothing bad happens and everybody knows where you're coming and going. A winter weather advisory again until 5 o'clock in the morning tomorrow for the western tip of the Seward Peninsula and St. Lawrence Island. Here's a look at the big weather picture, and those strong and gusty winds are working up the west coast in advance of a storm system. We've got another disturbance right about here, but the big storm is still just now crossing over the Aleutians with low pressure there. That's about 950 millibars or so. And in advance of that, a front is really rapidly pushing northward quickly, and you can see the change in the cloud deck right about here. That's where the frontal boundary is. Behind that is just a wealth of moisture and wind around low pressure as it moves across the North Pacific. Now, the rest of Alaska has enjoyed a fairly clear sky again, very cold weather across the interior and the west, but that high pressure ridge is starting to retreat a little bit more back into the interior and the western and central sections of the Yukon and western Canada. Southeast has been fairly quiet and clear, and you can see very little going on across the Gulf. We've got a weak disturbance here that's pulling away from most of what's coming our way from the western sections of the North Pacific. As you look out across the west, most of the active weather is going to actually move north and west. So watch this storm over the next couple maps. It's probably going to curve back into the western Bering Sea, and that will help to diminish the impacts from any of the strength of the storm, but we'll still be talking about some strong and gusty southerly winds for the next couple days across the west coast of Alaska. With ice in place, that's good news. That should limit a lot of the impacts, if any, across the region. But we are going to lose some of that ice as well as the system continues working north and west. Here's a look at the map then. Low pressure is down to about 993 millibars. Now it is deepening rapidly as it continues trekking north and east. Watch for periods of snow around the western tip of the Seward Peninsula, St. Lawrence Island, Nunivak Island, and then once you get to the Alaska Peninsula, a lot of that is still going to be dealing with rain there, it looks like. Conditions are still warm enough for periods of rainfall there. Now, many places across coastal areas of south central today we're dealing with freezing fog. That is liquid droplets that are super cooled but freezing on very cold surfaces. It was not snowing most of the time. but that moisture was freezing on contact. It's something that folks in the interior know well about, and many in southeast have probably experienced. Today, though, generally clear sky. Temperatures were in the cool sector there for southeast, only in the 20s and 30s. Some places only in the teens. And tonight's going to be another cool one for the interior, of course, with temps anywhere from 20 to probably 40 below in some cases. South central, not a whole lot different than what we saw last night. In southeast, you're looking at temperatures that are also still on the cold side, with high pressure large and in charge there across British Columbia and the western Yukon. Now, out across the west, low pressures down to about 954 overnight. The front continues trekking northward there into the western Bering Sea with periods of rain and snow across the west. Some of the heaviest snow again will be across the western tip of the Seward Peninsula and St. Lawrence Island, with that winter weather advisory in place for up to 4 inches of accumulation. Southwest, looking at periods of rain and snow, and rain showers across the Alaska Peninsula, Cold Bay and Sand Point there, and then west of Nikolsky, closer to the front, you're expected to see a better chance for showers and precipitation there. Across the interior and just south of the central interior, especially from Healy, let's say, all the way down the Parks Highway, we're still talking about a generally clear sky for Tuesday. In many of the passes, especially in the west, we'll start to see a transition over to more of a cloudier sky. Ceilings will start to drop off once you get through a few of the passes in the afternoon. And you'll notice that change creeping eastward a little bit more on Wednesday, but for most of the main passes there in the Alaska Range, conditions should probably be okay for Tuesday, though there may be some fog out in the Copper River Basin. For southeast, look for generally clear sky. Just offshore, though, conditions will change to more of a cloudier regime. Periods of rain and snow showers there. Rain and snow showers in the vicinity of Kodiak Island and the Barren Islands, a better chance for snow showers there with high pressure still in charge. But that, working with low pressure out across the western Bering, is going to keep that southerly flow zipping right across the western sections of the 49th state. Across the Alaska Peninsula, periods of rain and fog at times, especially on the south-facing coastlines. Out across the central and western chain, rain mixing with snow. And there will be plenty of wind with that as well. Northern areas up around St. Lawrence Island and the western tip of the Seward Peninsula will start to see weather improving, especially in the Seward Peninsula as the day goes on. It looks like the bulk of that heavier snow will shift to the north and to the west. In the meantime, high pressure still in charge of the north slope and likely looking at ice fog there. So you might see some of that rime icing once again in a few places there with clouds across the north slope, a large part of the Yukon Valley, and certainly across the west. So we get into Wednesday, low pressure is coming up to 973. But notice there's another weather system just off to the west at 958 millibars. The front will have moved on to the western coast of Alaska. Snow will be found along that boundary and inland, maybe as far east as McGrath. But high pressure across the north slope and the interior is really wanting to slow things down again. So instead of this weather system moving from west to east, it's having to move north because it simply can't encroach across this large area of very stable weather. Down to the south, another extension of that high pressure system, and that has a weaker boundary sitting across the north and eastern Gulf. It's been there for the last several days, and as we saw in the last chart there, the clouds and the precipitation hang just offshore, it looks like for now. That seems to be the case. If that is true, that will keep southeast Alaska in a generally clear sky, but there may be some breezes from time to time as you see that pressure gradient packing in a little bit more as we get into the midweek. Let's look at your weather as we go through the midweek there. Let's take a look at today's temperatures. Teens and 20s for most locations across southeast. Another cold day if you're in Sitka. It's down to 28 degrees. Port Alexander around 25. Down in toward Haida Gwaii, temperatures there were just above freezing, and you saw Hyder only at 18. Capital City around 13 degrees. 18 in Yakutat, 10 in Valdez. Single digits up and down Cook Inlet today. 22 around Homer, 21 for Seward. Teens again for Prince William Sound. Golcanna was only 23 below as we got into the late afternoon hours. 15 below in Eagle, 31 below around Tok, and Northway 22 below for our friends in Fairbanks. Healy was 2 above, and areas up around Tanana about 20 below, 29 below for Fort Yukon. When you get up toward Arctic Village, it was 21 below, 5 above, and in fact many areas across the North Slope are actually in positive territory today. Look at Barrow at 18, same goes for Wainwright. Go inland a little bit, and temperatures went sub-zero to about 4 below in Atkasut. As you get to the Kotzebue Sound region, single-digit temps there for Kotzebue, just below 10 degrees, 19 in Shishmaruk, 20 for Nome, 21 in Unalakleet, 15 below in Galena, 22 below in McGrath, and regions around Sparivon and Lake Iliamna were only in the single digits and teens today. Bristol Bay temps in the teens and 20s as you get into the Alaska Peninsula range. 39 degrees for Sand Point. Cold Bay and False Pass were in the mid-30s today, maybe even upper 30s at times. 41 for Unalaska and Dutch Harbor. 39 in St. Paul, just a hair cooler in St. George. Adak, Atka, and Shemya all showed up in the lower 40s late this afternoon, and overnight low temperatures won't change a whole lot from that mark. Teens and 20s for the southwest coast. Norton Sound temps in the teens. 18 for Nome. Kotzebue Sound in the low to mid-teens, upper teens there around Shishmaref. Single digits for Barrow. A few places might go sub-zero like Prudhoe Bay and Dead Horse. 39 below in Fort Yukon, 26 below in Fairbanks. The Parks Highway Corridor looking at temps from 5 to 10 below. South Central also looking at sub-zero temps again. Prince William Sound in the single digits, and southeast in the teens and mid-20s for many. Juneau about 14. High temps tomorrow, 10 to 20 below for many across the upper Yukon Valley. Single digits to about 10 for the North Slope. Kotzebue Sound in the teens and 20s. Norton Sound temps in the mid-teens to upper 20s around Nome. 28 degrees there, 35 in Savunga, 42 for St. Paul. As you get into southwest in the YK Delta, 20s and 30s for most locations. Kodiak, you're looking at 38. 30s and 40s for the Alaska Peninsula, 42 for Unalaska and Dutch Harbor. Low 40s as well for the central and western chain. South Central in the teens, so a milder day it looks like for many, and 20s for most of southeast. Some outer coast temperatures like Sitka could make it up to about 35. Flying weather now. Well, it looks like IFR will rule the roost up north there across the North Slope. IFR conditions to start the day all the way down through the Bering Strait, southwest coast, the Alaska Peninsula, central chain, and the Pribilofs. Will we see improvement in the afternoon? Well, let's take a look. A little bit. It kind of cuts in a little bit across the west coast there up around northwestern Alaska. Some major improvements there compared to how you start. But notice what's happening here in southwest. IFR conditions start sneaking up the Kuskokwim almost all the way to the McGrath. IFR for St. Lawrence Island, Nunivak Island, south coast of Kodiak Island, and also the Pacific coast of a large chunk of the Alaska Peninsula, as well as the south-facing coast of the eastern Aleutians, including maybe wrapping around the eastern side of Dutch Harbor and Unalaska. So we'll be watching that carefully. MVFR spreading across the northern Gulf, but most of the interior passes again are going to remain probably VFR through a good chunk of the day. Let's check your passes. Anaktuvuk Pass and Adigan Pass looking at VFR conditions through the day. If you're heading west through Lake Clark and Merrill Pass, you're going to find increasing lowered ceilings and visibility as you go. MVFR conditions predicted by afternoon. Rainy Pass, VFR, it looks like through most of the day. Windy Pass and Isabel Pass, we expect to see VFR conditions. Antasta Pass, visual flight rules should rule today. Tanita Pass, we expect to see VFR through a good chunk of the day. No problems eastward. Portage Pass, there's going to be an MVFR region kind of moving northward as the day goes on. So this might skirt the Portage Pass through a large part of the day, but keep your eyes on what's coming in from the south. And Chilkoot and White Pass, visual flight rules expected to continue there. Freezing levels show the surface freezing line just south of a large chunk of southeastern Alaska and over Kodiak Island and outside of Bristol Bay. Notice what's happening here. We're getting that overrunning again. So if there's going to be a possibility for some mixed precipitation or freezing rain or drizzle, this would be the area where that could be possible. So keep your eyes on the weather pilots especially. That is bad news for you if that shapes up. Icing potential below 2,000 feet across the north coast. Again, fog would be a general problem there. Around St. Lawrence Island and the Bering Strait and north of Nunivak Island above 2,000 feet, and then wrapping around low pressure as it's working through the central chain from about 4 to about 6,000 feet. Some of that could reach into the occasional moderate across the central Aleutians. Elsewhere, southeast, south central, and most of the interior, not expecting any widespread problems. On to the jet stream, and what a mess this is, isn't it? A low pressure across the western Bering has a huge area of low pressure wrapping in there with some very strong southerlies on top at 100 knots. No wonder we're seeing some of the strong wind shape up at the surface, right? This is driving that surface storm, but on the other side of that, on the other side of this ridge that is still controlling a large part of the Chukchi Sea, the west coast, and the central and northern Pacific, we have the descending air coming out of the Arctic, and that has full blast, full bore, all cold weather coming across the interior and through the Gulf with wind speeds there from 60 to 80 knots. Now that is also driving in all of that unsettled weather that we're hearing about across the Pacific Northwest and the West Coast, and allowing all the cold to drain into the Midwest and in some cases even the deep south. So that's where all the Alaska cold is going. At 9,000 feet you can see high pressure slowing the wind down across the interior and the Gulf, only about 20 to 25 knots wrapping around that in a clockwise fashion. Westerlies are blowing up the Kuskokwim and up the Yukon River, and at slow rates. They're about 5 to 15 knots. A northwesterly flow light across the north slope, and then here is the low pressure system mirrored at 9,000 feet with wind speeds wrapping around that from 40 to about 55 knots. Winds are fairly light across southeast as well, generally northerly at about 20 knots. At 3,000 feet, winds remain light around high pressure and in the interior, 20 knots from the north and west over the Beaufort seacoast, and a much stronger southerly flow coming up the west coast. 40 to 50 knots there, and even stronger winds across the central and western chain as high as 60 knots on the south side of that low. And because of that, turbulence may be a developing issue throughout the day tomorrow. Watch for isolated severe possible across the Alaska Peninsula, occasional moderate across the chain and across parts of the YK Delta, generally below 4,000 feet. The interior, southeast, and south central look to be A-OK. That's a look at your aviation weather. I'll be back with the rest of your marine weather here in just a few minutes.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Mary O'Connor with the Alaskan Aviation Safety Foundation and the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health. Thank you to Alaska Public Media for allowing us to bring you hangar flying. This evening, we have Gary Bennett from Northern Lights Avionics back on our show. Thanks for being here, Gary.
Thank you.
So, last time we were talking about limitations with, say, a Super Cub and installation of ADS-B equipment.
Sure.
So, if you have a limited panel, is it possible to use a tablet or an iPad or something like that to display what you need to see rather than have a glass cockpit installed?
Yes.
With the total overhaul?
Absolutely. It's a good question because, you know, tablets and iPhones and Android devices and things like that have become very popular in finding their way into the cockpits, you know, mainly for flight navigation information and things like that. And there's been a lot of apps that have come about that add in the ability to display ADS-B in information on top of that same map. So for most of the small general aviation aircraft to stay away from the expense of putting in a multifunction display, the iPads, those types of devices with popular apps out there have been the most popular way of displaying that.
And I suppose that helps cut back on price if somebody already has a tablet or some kind of device that they're used to using.
Yep, yeah, so a lot of people are using the same device that they surf the web with and shop Amazon and go flying, you know. And so with that, it becomes a very powerful tool in the cockpit.
So that's just one of the questions that pilots might be thinking of when they think about, well, should I equip with ADS-B or how should I equip if they make that commitment to do so? What are some other questions that they might want to consider when they are looking at their options for equipping?
Well, usually when people come in shopping for ADS-B, where I start with is, do you want ADS-B in? Because that's an important way to start, because you need to figure out how they want to display the ADS-B in, such as, like we talked about earlier, a tablet or something like that. So I usually start with that. A lot of people already have a favorite type of app that they're using for flying with, and not all apps are compatible with all the different types of equipment. So that type of information helps steer you down the path of what type of equipment that you want to put in to have the ADS-B out.
Okay. Do pilots consider where they're flying because the ADS-B out is only required for certain types of airspace?
That's correct. And for Alaska, really, there's a very, very small chunk of airspace where in 2020, when the mandate hits, that you're going to be required, and that's basically the Anchorage Class C airspace and above it. So there's another mandate for flying above 10,000 feet, which Alaska is exempt from. So again, just the Anchorage Class C would be the only required airspace in Alaska.
And we talked a little bit about redundancies and confusion, and one thing that pilots really shouldn't assume is that their ADS-B takes the place of a satellite tracking device or a transponder. or an ELT, that ADS-B is one unit, but it serves its own purposes, and they still need to have some additional safety features, correct?
Yes, that's correct. So really, we look at the ADS-B as the modern day transponder. So that really takes the place of what ATC is going to be needing and requiring here in the future for flight following and vectoring in airspace and things like that. And at the same time, you get the benefit of possibility having the in. Like you'd mentioned, ELTs and satellite tracking devices, those are two other separate items that are important, possibly important for the operator.
And do you think that it is important for pilots to consider the safety features of the ADS-B as a reason to equip for in?
Sure. The majority of the customers that we have equipped with ADS-B out and in are really doing it for their own safety benefit. And that's what we found. And I usually start off with, that finding out what type of flying they do, where they fly in and out of, and let them know that, be upfront with the fact that, look, it doesn't sound like your type of flying is going to require this. And so far, resoundingly, 100% of the people didn't really care. They wanted ADS-B anyways for their own safety benefit.
That is great to know.
Yes.
Very good. Well, we're going to have you back on our next show and talk about the process and how pilots might go about applying for this rebate and what they need to do in order to get $500 from the FAA.
Be glad to.
Thanks, Gary. Ladies and gentlemen, we hope you've enjoyed Hangar Flying. We appreciate your support. Until next time, fly safely.
Thanks. See you again on Friday. Here's a look at today's sea ice edge, and the areas in blue are the less than 80% concentration. Areas in white are much higher concentrations. They're above 80%, and you can see that more widespread ice in the form around Norton Sound, Kotzebue Sound, and also into southwestern Alaska and Bristol Bay, and also across northern parts of Cook Inlet. And there's even some low concentration ice around Kachemak Bay, as we saw yesterday. Now, with the stronger southerly winds, a lot of this is going to be compacted. A lot of this is going to be on the move northward, and even the ice around the Bering Strait and into the Chukchi Sea will be in motion there. So don't count on some of the ice, especially in southwestern Alaska, being just as you see it in the next couple days with those stronger southerly winds moving through. As we look at southeast, we'll be dealing with northerly winds across the inside waters there as we go into Tuesday afternoon, 10 to 15 knots from south to north there. You can see 3 to as low as 2 foot seas inside of Clarence Strait, 3 foot seas around the Lynn Canal. Around the outer coast, 15 to 20 knots there from the north and northwest. Seas remain generally small, 5 to about 6 feet there from Yakutat all the way down toward Craig. On Wednesday, north and easterly winds develop off of the coast of Yakutat there, 15 knots with a 5 foot sea. Otherwise, northwesterlies continue and come up to about 20 knots with a 6 to 7 foot sea. The inside waters also respond to an increasing, a stronger pressure gradient, 35 knots in the north and Lynn Canal, 7 foot seas there, and 10 to 20 knots across the central and southern inside waters, 2 to 4 foot seas expected there on Wednesday. As we look at south central, winds remain light inside of Prince William Sound with small seas. Northeasterlies inside of Cook Inlet come up as you pass Calgon Island, 20 knots with an 8 foot sea, and west of the Barrens even more. Southeasterlies inside of Shelikof Strait, 20 knots with a 5 foot sea, and west and southwesterlies across the western Gulf, 20 to 25 with a 5 to 8 foot sea there on Tuesday. As we look at Wednesday, conditions diminish a little bit there, 10 to 15 knots, and even go variable around areas outside of Resurrection Bay and across the western Gulf, 10 to 15 knots, 4 to 10 foot seas. You get into those higher seas as you pass the eastern Barrens and the eastern side of Kodiak Island. We'll maintain a stronger northeasterly flow across Cook Inlet, though, 10 to 20 knots with a 2 to as high as 7 foot seas there as you head west of the Barrens and south of Calgon Island. Now, as you look at the Bristol Bay region, 20 knots with an easterly flow, 3-foot seas there in the open water. Southeasterlies down the Bering Sea coast with 9-foot seas on a 35-knot wind, and much stronger winds across the other side there in the Pacific, 40 knots with a 17-foot sea there on Tuesday. Going into Wednesday, the winds diminish, still coming in from a south and southeasterly flow over through Bristol Bay and the Pacific coast, 20 to 25 with 5 to 8-foot seas on the Bering Sea coast and 13 to 16-foot seas there on the Pacific coast. For the Aleutians, considerably stronger winds closer to the core of low pressure there. You're looking at storm force winds there, 50 to 55 knots, 24 to 27-foot seas in the west, 16 to as low as 12-foot seas across the Bering Sea coast for the central and eastern chain, and 30 to 45-knot winds across the Pacific coast with seas as high as 19 to 23 feet. Of course, there will be some higher gusts in the region. Conditions improve slightly on Wednesday. Not entirely, though. Still looking at some decent gales for most areas in the central and western chain, 35 to 45 knots with seas as high as 24 feet in the west, 17 to 20-foot seas across the Pacific coast, and that south and southwest flow continues for 15 to 18-foot seas across the Bering Sea coast with 25-foot seas north of Unalaska and Dutch Harbor with an 11-foot sea there around Nikolsky as well on Wednesday. For the west coast, easterlies over St. Lawrence Island, 35 knots with a 7-foot sea, 30 to 40-knot winds across the southern Bering and Kuskokwim Delta with seas around the Pribilofs as high as 16 feet. That improves slightly on Wednesday, but not by much. Southerlies are back at 30 knots with 15-foot seas there, 22-foot seas around St. Matthew, and 11 to 13-foot seas across the northern Bering with higher gusts continuing, even though the bulk of the heavier snowfall may have ended. Across the north slope, ice is in all the places now, and north and northeasterly winds for the Beaufort Seacoast 10 to 15, and offshore easterly wind for the Chukchi Coast 15 to 20 there, generally from the east, and a little change there on Wednesday, but not by much. More of a southeasterly flow coming in at 30 knots over Cape Lisburne, and a north and easterly flow for the Beaufort at about 10 to 25 on Wednesday. Recapping tonight's weather, strong gusty winds across the south and a winter weather advisory for the western tip of the Seward Peninsula and St. Lawrence Island, up to 4 inches of snow there, and poor visibility below 1/2 mile there. Watch for that to continue until early tomorrow morning. Conditions will gradually improve, but southerly winds will remain in place across the west coast through midweek. Thanks for watching Alaska Weather.
These forecasts are to be used for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
The National Weather Service.
Support comes from the University of Alaska College Savings Plan, helping you and your child save for college every step of the way, from diapers to diploma. More information at uacollegesavings.com.